There are people who walk into a room and you feel them before you see them. Not because they're loud, not because they're the most attractive person there, but because the air shifts, this subtle tension, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. You don't know where it's coming from. You shake hands, you smile, you make small talk, and then a few hours or days later, you realize you did exactly what they wanted. Not because anyone forced you, because you decided to, or at least that's what you thought. Francis Shea from the film Legend is exactly that kind of person. She doesn't scream, threaten, or push. She speaks quietly, smiles at the right moments, says the right things. And the whole time, she's operating everyone around her with surgical precision. The Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, were considered the most dangerous men in 1960s London. But look closer, and something becomes undeniable. The most dangerous person in this story wore a skirt and spoke in a soft voice. Let's talk about how this type of manipulator actually works, because Francis isn't some invented archetype. People like her are everywhere in real life, far more than you'd think. They might be right next to you. And if you're being honest with yourself, you might recognize a little of this in your own behavior, even if you've never consciously thought about it that way. Malcolm Gladwell once made the point that the most powerful events in history don't happen when someone does something loud and obvious. They happen at quiet tipping points, where a small, almost invisible action sets an entire chain reaction in motion. Francis Shea is the living embodiment of that idea. She's not a revolutionary, not a boss, not a brute. She is the tipping point in Reggie Kray's life. One look, one sentence, one decision, and the whole machine starts moving in the direction she wants. Robert Greene, in the 48 Laws of Power, argues that real power never shows its face directly. Real power hides behind the appearance of weakness, vulnerability, innocence, because people put their guard up against force. They don't put their guard up against fragility. Nobody builds defenses against someone who's crying. Nobody prepares for an attack from a quiet girl with sad eyes. That is Francis's primary weapon. But here's something critical to understand. Francis Shea is not a villain. She didn't draft a manipulation strategy in a notebook. She never read Greene. She survived. She built her behavioral model as a response to a world where a woman without money, without connections, without status was nothing. And she found the only lever available to her, emotional influence over a man who needed her. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing it. Understanding it means seeing the full picture. So let's break it down. The first layer of Francis's manipulation model is creating dependency through exclusivity. When Reggie first encounters her, she doesn't run toward him. She holds back, cool, slightly distant, just enough mystery to make you lean in. This isn't an accident, and it's not just playing hard to get for the sake of it. It's an instinctive understanding of basic human psychology. The harder something is to obtain, the more valuable it feels. Robert Cialdini called this the scarcity principle. When something is rare, we want it more. When someone is too available, interest flatlines. When someone creates the feeling of, "I'm not sure you can have me," desire spikes. Francis never says no, she says maybe, but with a look that means prove it. And Reggie proves it, over and over again. He changes his behavior, makes sacrifices, reconfigures his world, all to earn her approval. Now ask yourself, who is actually running this situation? Mark Manson wrote something essential in The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***. We always choose what matters to us, and whoever cares less holds more power in the relationship. Francis masterfully creates the illusion that she could take it or leave it, that she'd be fine without him, that she'll walk if she has to. Reggie Kray, a man who controlled entire neighborhoods of London, who could alter someone's fate with a single phone call, acts like an anxious teenager around Francis. Why? Because she occupies the position of keeping myself matters more than keeping you, and that flips the entire dynamic on its head. The second layer of her model is control through emotional debt. This is a subtle instrument, which is exactly why it's so hard to spot. Francis never demands anything directly. She suffers. She goes quiet, but with a quality of silence that screams louder than words. She does something kind and then waits. She doesn't call in the favor immediately. She waits. And then, when the moment is right, she reminds you, not with words, but with her posture, a glance, a pause in the conversation. Psychologists call this guilt induction. The mechanism is simple. You create in another person the feeling that they owe you something, not because they actually wronged you, but because you suffered near them and they witnessed it. You suffered visibly enough that they felt responsible, and now they'll do what you want, not because you asked, but because they can't stand feeling guilty. This isn't blackmail, it's more refined than that. It's an emotional credit line that can never be fully paid off, because the lender can always say, "You still owe me." Watch how this plays out in the film. Reggie Kray is a gangster, a killer, a man with genuine psychopathic traits, but around Francis, he's constantly justifying himself, constantly explaining, constantly trying to prove he's not as bad as he looks. Why? Because she's created an environment in which he feels guilty for existing as he is. He doesn't leave because leaving would mean finally admitting he's unworthy of her forgiveness. That's brilliantly cruel. And Francis doesn't think of it as a strategy. To her, this is just how you love someone, or what she mistakes for love. The third layer is control through narrative. Francis is remarkably skilled at managing how Reggie sees himself. She is his mirror, but not an honest mirror, a filtered one. When she needs to push him toward action, she reflects back the image of a powerful, worthy, commanding man. When she needs to keep him close, she reflects back the image of someone who fall apart without her. She is literally constructing his identity to serve her needs. Green writes about this in The Laws of Human Nature. The most effective way to control a person is to convince them that your agenda is actually their values. Not "do what I want," but "you know this is the right thing to do." Francis never says, "I want you to get out of the criminal life." She says, "I believe you're capable of more." That sounds like support. What it actually is pressure wrapped in a compliment. And here's where it gets really interesting, because Francis's manipulation is double-edged. She gets trapped inside her own narrative. She falls in love with the version of Reggie she invented, not the actual Reggie Kray, with his violence, his mental instability, his absolute inability to change, but the idea of Reggie, the man who could have been different, and she fights for that idea so fiercely that she destroys herself in the process. This is a classic projective dynamic in relationships, not in the clinical sense, but in the very human sense of loving someone's potential instead of the person in front of you. Francis doesn't love Reggie, she loves what Reggie could become. And that is the most destructive kind of love there is, because the potential never materializes, but you keep waiting and resenting and manipulating harder, trying to pull out of someone a version of them that simply doesn't exist. The fourth layer is isolation through intimacy. It's a paradox, but it's absolutely real. Francis gradually becomes the only person in the world with whom she can be herself, or rather the self she's constructed for him. She creates between them a private world, a sealed chamber of intimacy where no one else is permitted. Not his brother Ronnie, not his crew, not his old friends. And Reggie starts experiencing reality through a single lens. There's Francis, and there's everyone else. This is extremely effective because isolation creates dependency. When you have only one source of emotional warmth, you'll do anything not to lose it. You'll tolerate things you'd walk away from in any other context, because losing that one source means total emptiness. Gladwell's work on social networks shows this dynamic clearly. When you cut someone off from their existing connections and become their primary emotional contact, you gain enormous influence over them, not through coercion, but through manufactured need. Francis does this intuitively. She never says, "Stop talking to Ronnie." She just creates an atmosphere in which Reggie naturally begins to prefer her company above all others. He thinks it's love, it's architecture. The fifth layer, and the deepest, and the most destructive, is manipulation through self-destruction. Francis ultimately dismantles herself, and this is not an accident. It's the logical endpoint of her entire behavioral model, because a manipulator who uses suffering as a tool will eventually start suffering for real. The line between "I'm strategically performing pain" and "I am genuinely destroyed" disappears entirely.
She drinks, she takes pills, she slips into depression, and all of this is simultaneously real suffering and the final pressure move against Reggie. Look what you've done to me. I'm not being cynical here. I'm describing how the psychology actually functions in someone who has spent years using their own pain as currency. At some point, the pain becomes authentic, but the function it serves remains the same. Green would frame it this way: every tool of power comes with a price, and the price of manipulation with weakness is that you eventually become genuinely weak. You've played the role of a fragile person for so long that you've forgotten how to be strong. You've used pain as a weapon for so long that you've lost the ability to simply not be in pain. Now let's talk about how to recognize this pattern in real life, because Francis Shea is not a movie character. She lives among us. Sometimes she's your partner.